Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're stepping into a rather dark, complex, but absolutely vital corridor of human psychology and political philosophy. We're investigating a really haunting mystery. Why do totally normal, good people end up obeying bad leaders? How do seemingly ordinary individuals find themselves participating in horrific acts, not out of malice, but just out of a sense of duty? Well, we're going to unpack what we can call the architecture of obedience and look at exactly how our minds, our societies, and even our core philosophies are structured to make us comply. To truly grasp the gravity of this, there's this incredibly chilling observation by George Orwell, which Stanley Milgram actually captured in his research. Orwell wrote, as I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual. It just perfectly frames the terrifying phenomenon we're exploring here. We're looking at civilized people committing absolute atrocities simply by doing their jobs. It's a crazy thought, right? The idea that the person dropping the bomb doesn't even hate the person it falls on. So that brings us right to a concept you might have heard of, the banality of evil. It was originally coined by Hannah Arendt, and Milgram actually found in his own experiments that her theory was way closer to the truth than anyone really wanted to admit. We aren't talking about sadistic monsters with twisted personalities here. No, we're talking about ordinary individuals whose moral controls have just been completely shunted aside. People who act out of a strict sense of obligation to authority, rather than any aggressive tendencies. But to understand how a modern person can even reach that point, we first kind of have to understand why humanity is primed to obey in the first place. All right, let's start with Section 1, Foundations of Authority and Consent. Okay, let's dive into this. If we go way back to the ancient, candlelit libraries of political philosophy, specifically Plato's Republic, Socrates makes a really fascinating distinction about deception in society. First, he talks about the true lie. This is a lie told to the soul about the most important things in life. It misleads reason and, as Plato argues, it's universally hated by both gods and humans. But then we have the noble or verbal lie. Plato actually argued that rulers often find it completely necessary to use these verbal lies as a sort of, a drug to prevent evil and bind society together. Think of things like rigged lotteries for eugenics or foundational myths. The rulers essentially manufacture consent and social harmony by teaching their subjects a false worldview. So the very seed of obedience is planted in the myths we're told from day one. Fast forward a bit to the Enlightenment era, and Thomas Hobbes formalizes this whole idea in his famous work, Leviathan. Hobbes argued that sovereign power is erected by the actual consent of the subjects, primarily just for their own defense. Because we consent to be governed so we can stay safe, we literally become instruments of the state. Hobbes described public ministers as the nerves and tendons that move the limbs of the political body. It's a striking, almost biological metaphor, isn't it? Under the social contract, disobeying authority isn't just illegal. Hobbes considered it a literal sin against the very liberty you were granted. You consented to the system, therefore you absolutely must obey its commands. But, what happens when we take those philosophical boundaries and test them empirically? Which brings us to Section 2, Inside Milgram's Laboratory. So let's shift our focus from dusty philosophical theory to a stark 1960s laboratory to look at Stanley Milgram's groundbreaking psychological tests. Milgram wanted to experimentally test the absolute limits of this obedience we've been discussing. He set up the scenario where subjects were instructed to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to a learner. And what's fascinating is how Milgram continuously tweaked his design. See, in pilot studies, when there was no verbal feedback from the victim, almost everyone just went straight to the maximum shock. So he had to introduce the cries of pain to actually create some resistance. He meticulously calibrated the whole experiment to see exactly what forces were required to keep a person submitting to authority, eventually hitting an astonishing compliance rate of around 65% in his baseline condition. Now, what's really interesting about this progression is how incredibly insidious it is. It utilizes what are called binding factors to essentially lock a subject into the situation. It doesn't start with a demand to torture someone. Obviously not. It just starts with an initial simple promise to help an experimenter. Then, basic social politeness takes over. The subject just wants to put on a competent performance. Finally, there's the growing, palpable awkwardness of withdrawing. Breaking off the experiment actually means breaking a social bond with the authority figure right there in the room. These binding factors act like a psychological trap that just slowly, quietly snaps shut around you. But let's be real, administering shocks to a screaming person is incredibly stressful. So how on earth do subjects cope with that? Well, Milgram observes specific stress-reducing mechanisms. First off, the action is framed as a legitimate learning experiment, a noble pursuit of science. Second, the subject drastically narrows their cognitive field. They become entirely absorbed in the exacting technical procedures of reading word pairs and flipping switches, completely losing sight of the broader consequences. Milgram actually compared this to a bomber crew in the film Dr. Strangelove, who becomes so utterly focused on the technical aspects of dropping a weapon that they forget the massive devastation it causes on the ground. And finally, removing the victim from the visual field makes denials so much easier. When you can't physically see the suffering, empathy is drastically reduced. So we've seen the trap, we've seen the coping mechanisms, but what is the exact psychological switch where a human being actually loses their autonomy? Moving on to Section 3. Entering the agentic state. Milgram actually had a specific name for this switch. He called it the agentic state. This is a critical, fundamental shift in human functioning. It is literally the master attitude of obedience. When a person enters this state, they no longer view themselves as acting out of their own purposes. Instead, they see themselves simply as an agent executing the wishes of another person. The individual completely loses sight of broader moral consequences, basically because they no longer consider themselves the author of their own actions. They've handed over the steering wheel. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that shift works mechanically. If we look at Milgram's own cybernetic diagrams of human hierarchy, we see that when autonomously functioning elements, that's us, individuals, are brought into a hierarchical system, the internal structure of those elements literally has to change. To maintain system coherence, you have to suppress local control. Your conscience, your personal superego, which normally regulates your day-to-day actions, must be ceded to a superordinate point. You basically give up your internal moral compass in favor of control from the authority above you. And that leads us to our final part, Section 4, the evaporation of responsibility. Let's zoom out for a second, away from the micropsychology of the lab, and look at the macro level of modern society as a whole. This reliance on hierarchy leads to what Milgram termed the administrative outlook. As society develops, we rely super heavily on the division of labor, right? This creates highly specialized, incredibly narrow jobs. But morally speaking, this means the total human act becomes completely fragmented. Individuals end up acting as mere intermediaries in a long chain of events. We saw this horrifyingly illustrated in events like the My Lai massacre, where soldiers committed unthinkable atrocities not purely out of individual malice, but because they were deeply embedded in a rigid military chain of command. Because everyone is just doing their small, technical part, the person assuming ultimate responsibility simply evaporates. It's perhaps the most common and terrifying characteristic of socially organized evil in our modern world. Milgram drove this point home with a profoundly disturbing historical observation. He noted, even Eichmann was sickened when he toured the concentration camps, but to participate in mass murder, he had only to sit at a desk and shuffle papers. That is incredibly dark, but it shows us that physical and bureaucratic distance makes it psychologically easy to just ignore the reality of an evil action. When you are just a cog in the administrative machine, separated from the final outcome by layers and layers of hierarchy, the horrific just becomes routine. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to reflect upon. We all exist within hierarchies, at our jobs, in our governments, in our communities. From Plato's noble lies to Hobbes' social contracts, all the way down to Milgram's agentic state. The architecture of obedience is built into the very fabric of our lives. So the next time you find yourself simply following orders or just doing your highly specialized job within a larger system, ask yourself, when you become a working part of a hierarchy, where does your own conscience actually go? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this breakdown helps you view the world and your place in it just a little bit more clearly.